When a Jewish person releases their Eved Ivri, their Jewish slave, they have a mitzvah called Hanukkah, which is to give them gifts. And apparently Hashem did that to us when we left Mitzrayim, except that it doesn't seem to conform to the rules of how Hanukkah works. And based on that, we're going to have a beautiful insight into what Hanukkah is, both practically as well as spiritually, as well as what the value is of being an Eved of Hashem. If mitzvah Hanukkah levad ivri ula'am ivriya zog the pasuk dem tam, the pasuk gives the reason why it is that you're supposed to give these gifts to an either a male or female Jewish servant when you release them to freedom, because the pasuk says zog the pasuk dem tam. The pasuk in our parasha tells us zacharta ki eved yisab eretz Mitzrayim. You should remember that you were a slave in Mitzrayim. Vayiftecha vaylekecha, and the Eibishter redeemed you. Al kain anoichim mitzavecha es hadavar hazeh hayoim. Therefore, says the Eibishter, I'm giving you this instruction of how to treat your slaves today. State of them in Sifri, the Sifri makes the comment, you have to remember how you were slaves in Mitzrayim. In this particular context means that Abisha gave us gifts and then he gave us further gifts. And from that you should learn that you too, that you should give your servant gifts and then give them more gifts as well. Says the Abisha, just like in Mitzrayim, I gave you very generously. You should be generous in the gifting to your servant when you let him free. As it says in Tilim, that when you are lying by the fireplace, your wings of the dove are going to be as if they're covered in silver. That alludes to the great wealth that Hashem gave us as we left Mitzrayim. And then also this concept of a different type of silver on a different part of the wings of the bird, that refers to the treasures that we got at the sea. Turei Zav Nase Lecha, the pasuk in Shir Hashirim that says that there are rows of gold given or made for you, Zay Bizas Hayam, that refers to what the Jews got at the sea. Im Nekudes HaKesef, together with spots of silver, Zay Bizas Mitzrayim refers to what we were given in Mitzrayim. So therefore, basically, the Sifri is saying that we see in this pasuk the principle, just like the Eibishter was so generous in his gifting to us after we were released from slavery, we should do the same for our avodim. Das says, in other words, the pasuk was the pasuk that says, remember, you were a slave in Mitzrayim, and Hashem redeemed you. Main to Zog, and according to the Sifri, is there to tell us, as the Eibishter hat ausgelesen die Eden from Mitzrayim und hat sich dabei gegeben hat 20 Hanukkah, because the Eibishter released us from Mitzrayim and gave us a double portion of gifting, Bizas Mitzrayim and Bizas Hayam, the bounty that we took out of Egypt, the bounty that we collected at the edge of the sea. Therefore, the Eibishter is instructing us to do the same, that we have to give gifts to our Jewish slaves, male or female, when we release them. There's one big question, though. The main message that the Sifri is extracting out of the pasuk is not referred to in the pasuk. Yes, this pasuk speaks about the fact that we have to remember we were slaves and that the Eibishter redeemed us, but it says nothing in this pasuk about the Eibishter giving us wealth or gifts. Yes, we know that from other contexts, but it's not in this pasuk. How does the Sifri derive it out of this pasuk? To understand that, we have to analyze three other problems, or apparent problems, with the Sifri's commentary. So, in order to understand it, let's examine the details of the halacha of Hanukkah as the Sifri describes them. Firstly, by introducing because the way that the Eibishter took us out of Egypt is supposed to be the source from which we learn all of the, firstly, the halacha of Hanukkah, but all of the details of that halacha. That's the expression the Sifri uses. Just like the Eibishter did, so should we do. Is move on. As Bizas Mitzrayim or Bizas Hayom, that means you must assume that the way that the Eibishter gave us the wealth at the Yitzias Mitzrayim and at Kriyas Yamsuf has to be according to the halachas of Hanukkah. It's not a generic gift to a slave who is now freed. In that case, it's tomorrow. Then there are three halachic problems with this principle. Number one, the definition of what you're supposed to give the servant when he leaves as part of Hanukkah is something which is included in bracha, meaning something that perpetuates, something that can grow, like animals that can produce. Things that will increase. Giving money is not Hanukkah. on Bizas Mitzrayim and Bizas Hayom is Beikar Bashtanim Fun Kesef Vezav Uvegodim. Now, if we're supposed to learn this out of Bizas Hayom and Bizas Mitzrayim, that was primarily things that do not increase or produce gold, silver, and garments. First, psukim and midrash chazal, as we know from many psukim and from many midrashim. First problem. Second problem, base. The whole principle of Hanokah is if the Eved was working for a Jewish person, not if they're working for a non-Jewish person. So now the Jewish people who were slaves to Egyptian people and got the wealth from the Egyptian people, how is that related to the halacha of Hanokah? Hanokah is for a Jewish master. That's not the case in this story. And lastly, Gimel, the chiv for Hanokah is a fin adon. In order to qualify as Hanokah, it is the master giving the slave the gift. On Doan Sefri is the Madgish, whereas the Sefri over here emphasizes, as the Hanokah by Yitzhak time is given from the Babyshin, that it was Hashem who gave us the gifts, not the Mitzrim who were the masters. It was the Eibishter who caused things to happen in such a way that we got wealth from or via the Egyptians. Hanakti v'shoni si nosati, as the Sifri says. Everything is about the Eibishter giving us. How does that qualify as Hanokah? The Eibishter was not the Adon in this particular story. Now, we're going to see something very similar with regards to Yosef, as pointed out by the Rebbe's father, and it will have similar problems. Just as the Sifri has just told us that the Jews, when leaving Mitzrayim, received these Hanokah gifts for having left. And there's something similar with Yosef. First of all, let's qualify he was an Eved, working for Potiphar. When he was eventually released, he got gifts. As the Rebbe's father points out. In the Sugya for Hanokah, the Gemara Kiddushin talks about this principle of Hanokah. In the analysis of that section, the Rebbe's father says the following. Yosef Ivri. First of all, Yosef was an Eved. What kind of an Eved? Obviously a Jewish Eved. The Pasuk says, Vasham itanu nar Ivri Eved, that when the royal butler goes back and reports to Paro, he says, together with us in the prison, there was a Jewish slave. So Hanokah says the Rebbe's father, in that case, an Eved Ivri who is now being freed, must receive the Hanokah gifts. So what Hanokah gifts did Yosef get? Besides what Paro gave him, his signet ring and this big golden chain, or big desheish and special clothing. The main gift that Yosef received was from the Eibishter directly, and that was the gift of sending Gabriel to teach him the 70 languages so he'd be able to rise to prominence in Paro's palace. You'll say, how does that help? How's that considered Hanokah? He wasn't the Eibishter's slave, he was Potiphar's slave, lahavdil. So how does it help the Eibishter to give him a gift? Hanokah says, Reb Leivik, that he also received a gift from Potiphar, and that is that he gave him his daughter, Osnas, as a wife, and that is that's the Hanokah that he got. Now, we have the three same questions that we had on the Sifri. Aleph, Yosef is given an Eved Ivri. Yes, it's true, Yosef was an Eved Ivri. So were the Jews in Egypt. They were also Jewish. But the person he was a slave to, like the Jews in Egypt, was a non-Jewish person who doesn't have the mitzvah of Hanokah. So how can you suggest that there's an obligation to give him the Hanokah gifts if the master is not Jewish? Number two, same question as we had with the Sifri. The master is the one who's supposed to give the gifts. Is Aleph, how come then does the Rebbe's father say that the main gift that Yosef received was from the Eibishter, if the Eibishter was not his master? And Beis, and how can we even suggest that the ring and the chain that Paro gave to Yosef is the Inyan for Hanokah, has anything to do with Hanokah? He should be receiving something from Potiphar, because Potiphar was his master. What's Paro got to do with this at all? And lastly, Gimel, the things that Yosef did receive, the ring and the golden chain, Ayin Loshen, or the understanding of the 70 languages, or Osnas, which is maybe the grey area over here, is you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Hanokah. So the only thing is, Osnas, you could say, is maybe something which is Bichlal HaBrocha, because Osnas can produce, you can have children, although that's not the typical kind of gift that you give as Hanokah. You'll say, why are we asking halachic questions from Reb Leivik's interpretation, which is based on Kabbalah? We know how much effort we employ to align the principles of Kabbalah with the principles of Nigla, the Torah, and Halacha. But as Kabbalah and Nigla, the Torah is a Torah achas, not because we're trying to align them, but because we understand that it's a singular Torah. Where the Nigla, the Torah, is like the body, and the Nista, the Torah, is like the Neshama. So they cannot be in contradiction with each other, and they have to absolutely seamlessly relate to each other. Kabbalah is megale dem oimek v'seid was is Nista in Nigla Shabbat. What Kabbalah does is it reveals the secrets that are embedded within Nigla, the Torah. There's no way, therefore, that Kabbalah could be in contradiction to Nista. Shloimar, as the Uftu is in Teres Shime, so therefore we have to suggest that what Reb Leivik is telling us, as by Yosef is dos given in Anoka, is meyusud in Sifri Hanal, the fact that Yosef's gifts, either from Paroi, or from Lahavdil Eibishter, or from Lahavdil Poitifar, is all actually in the category of Hanoka. That must be based on an area in Halacha which speaks about a similar thing, which is the Sifri. Because look what the Sifri already showed us, that there is a principle of Hanoka when the three conditions are not fulfilled. That is, even Hanoka when the Jewish slave belongs to a non-Jewish master. That it is possible to fulfill the mitzvah of Hanoka even if you're giving things which are not productive. And Gimel, that it's possible to consider the Hanoka even if it's not coming from the master. So if we solve the Sifri and how it gets around those three halachic issues, then the story of Yosef makes sense. But so the same thing will apply to Yosef. Yes, he was sold to Potiphar, a non-Jewish man. And the kind of gifts that he got were not necessarily bichlal habracha. And the hanaka that he got was not exclusively from his master. Potiphar gave him osnas. Now, be'ika from Paroi Mashanasan HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but primarily the gifts that he got from Paroi, and most specifically from the Eibishter, is the Sabra Hanoka. It still fits into the category of Hanoka, and our question is how? If we have rules of Hanoka, and these, both the Sifri's example and the Reb Leivik's example, seem not to fit with those rules, how is it considered Hanoka? To answer that question, we have to acknowledge that Hanoka comes from two angles, as we often see in Halacha. You've got to look from the perspective of the person who is responsible to do the mitzvah, and what the purpose and impact on the recipient is going to be. In Hanoka, there are two aspects of Hanoka. There is what the master is required to give his servant when he lets him free. And all of those restrictive clauses apply to the master. But on the other hand, there's Beis Kabbalah Eved. We also have to look from the perspective of what the Eved is receiving. Das was said, in dem Eved, what he gains, or how it affects him to get these gifts. So, the fact that the owner is required to give Hanoka, what's the reason? Because he's the person who previously enslaved this individual. And therefore, so the gifts that he's giving him are a show of gratitude for the effort that this Eved invested over whatever period of time he was a slave. To the extent, and the Rebbe's discussed this in a sikha we've actually learned together before, which is that the qualification of Hanoka is it's not a form of charity, it's a form of payment. In other words, it's owed to the recipient, to the Eved. So that's the perspective of the giver. The owner has to show gratitude. From the perspective of the recipient, the Eved is a saprat v'chelik von sein Shishler. Receiving this Hanoka is part of what it means to be liberated, to be freed. The shleimus hashichrur is a bergeit nitarois reikam. When is a slave truly free? When he doesn't walk out empty-handed. Now, but he walks out with a special gift. Was is mevatel in his hefech von avdus, and that gift undermines or cancels the slavery that he had, and in fact, it's the opposite of the slavery. Now is feeling really free because he has the freedom of financial freedom. That aspect of Hanoka, that it's what consolidates the freedom of the servant, is that's what our pasuk is talking about. Remember how you were in Mitzrayim, remember how the Eibishter took you out, and from that you will appreciate that giving the gift consolidates the freedom. Because we were slaves who were freed by Hashem. Therefore, we, when we free our slaves, have to ensure that we free them in the best way possible, in the same way as the Eibishter freed us in the best way possible. That helps us understand how the Sifri could identify that the great wealth we got both at Yetzias Mitzrayim and at Kriyas Yamsuf fits into the category of Hanokah, not some kind of charity that the Eibishter did for us. Considering that this pasuk is not focusing on the responsibility of the master to show gratitude to his slave, but rather that the theme over here is what it means to be freed as a slave, to have complete freedom, is in them. So there are two key things to bear in mind. Makes no difference who I was a slave to. If we're looking at my freedom, the history, the legacy of slavery is not so important to what constitutes my freedom now. And likewise, it doesn't matter who's now giving me the financial aid or the gift or the hanokah that I need in order to move forward. The main thing is I have the resources to move forward. So this guy who was previously an Eved currently has a gift which allows him to be free. We're focused on that he has the gift to allow him to be free. Which would also explain why the detail of what you give as the Hanokah is important for the master's giving, but for the Eved's recipient, what you're getting is not so important, and we'll see why. There's a psychology behind it. When do we insist that what the Adon gives to the Eved has to be something which has the bracha of proliferation and reproduction? Is from the perspective and the psychology of the master. He has to think of a gift that he's going to present to this Eved, so that even in the course of time, the Eved will constantly feel his gratitude for, so to speak, generations to come. That's his responsibility. But when I'm looking from the perspective of the Eved's freedom, which is the purpose of Hanokah, that's what grants him this absolute liberation, that now he's free to go because he has the money to be able to live. That happens at the moment he gets the gift. That doesn't have to perpetuate. The moment he left slavery, he had the wherewithal to be able to be on his 2 feet. And he's free, and that's what counts. So Hayos, that the Sifri is analyzing the pasuk of Vayiftecha, what does it mean to become free? Therefore, the Sifri is concerned with the fact that the Eved gets the Hanokah, not so much with the fact of what he got or who he got it from. Pizer Shleimer. That's a Chidish Din and Ilbud in Sifri. So now we can understand that the insight the Sifri is offering us, and Nakti Lecha, V'Shanisti Lecha, that the Eibishter says, I gave you gifts and then I gave you more gifts. You should do the same with your Eved. I was generous with you, so you should be generous with your servant. None of that is an insight into what the responsibility of the Adon is to present as a gift to his slave. That's saying you're nice if it's something else. However, is a definition of what it means for a slave to be free. If I'm looking from the perspective of the responsibility of the master, it's a limit. What you have to give, and then it's a sign of gratitude. And once you've discharged that responsibility, you've shown him the gratitude, you're good to go. Yes, that's be b'chlal bracha, etc. But if we're discussing what does it mean for this Eved to now feel free, there's no limit to say, okay, at this point you've done your responsibility. The more gifts he has, the more assets he walks out with. It could be the bare minimum, like a poor man, or the usher, or a wealthy man, or the or somebody who has an excess of property. The more he has, the freer he is going forward. And therefore, if you're looking from the perspective of what does it take in order to make the Eved free, give him again, be generous with him. That's why this pasuk does not emphasize the detail of the gift that the Eibishter gave us when we left Mitzrayim. But rather the fact that the Eibishter freed us. The limud from Yetzias Mitzrayim is what we're learning about the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is not from the Kamos Hanoka. It's not to emphasize how much the Eibishter gave us and again, was dann given, which was historical. The pasuk over here is emphasizing that just as the Eibishter there ensured that our freedom was absolute, was das meint bemele nicht was das meint bemele mit Kabbalas rechush gadol bis das sagen nakte lechava shanise lechava chulei. Freedom in its truest sense means lots of gifts or lots of assets. That's the Nakuda we're supposed to take according to the Sifri out of this pasuk. As the Shishler von Zeravodim soll sein b'shleimusay. When we free a Jewish slave, we should do so fully. And how do you release a slave in the most full way? By giving them generously multiple times. In the Rishima von Taten, which makes it much easier for us, of course, to understand what the Rebbe's father is telling us about Yosef. Bald as Yosef is given an Eved Ivri Shenishtacher, seeing as Yosef qualifies as an Eved Ivri who was freed, is not cooking. Who cares about the fact that Potiphar was the master and he's not Jewish? But in order for him to be free, there has to be Anoka in order that his freedom should be true and complete freedom. And there are two details that are relevant to this gifting. The Shleimus Shishler bepashtus ubefeil is given durch dem was Parotim in Mana given for Mishnah Lemelech. The one thing is, how do you know that Yosef is free? He's now the most senior member of Paro's parliament. The exact polar opposite of what it is to be a slave. That's represented by the ring and the golden chain. But how did that happen? What prepared Yosef to be in a position that he could be that second to Paroi? Where we know that there were complaints. How can you take this man who was a slave, sold for a pittance, and now you're going to put him in charge of us? So there, the advisors and astrologers to Paroi suggested that he has to know the 70 languages. So how was there the capacity for Yosef to become a leader in Mitzrayim? That's the gift the Eibishter gave him. That Gabriel came along and taught him the 70 languages. And the Pharisee Ikar HaNoka. That's why Rabbi Leivik tells us that is the primary gift, because without that, the other gift would never have happened. That's what prepared Yosef from his part, that he should be in a position to have absolute freedom. What's absolute freedom? The opposite of slavery. What's the absolute opposite of slavery? Being the ruler. The fact that he got a ring, the fact that he got a chain, that's just the practicalities of it. But what made the story happen is the Eibishter sending Gabriel to teach him. And then that's the first point. So the first point is, in order to become a ruler, which is the exact opposite of a slave, you need the Eibishter's gift. Then says Rabbi Leivik, there's something else as well. There's also a consideration that Hanokah is really supposed to come from the person who was previously the master. Meaning, even if I'm looking from the perspective of what is it to give a slave full freedom, the fullest freedom is when the gift comes from your master. What greater way is it to say you're free if your master is giving you a gift? When the person who previously was your master is now giving you a gift, that is the strongest declaration of freedom. In fact, when you consider that Potiphar gave him osnas, the halacha is that if the master gives the eved a wife, that is a form of freedom. Therefore, Rabbi Leivik tells us that in addition to the fact that he had this tremendous gift of going from absolute slave to absolute ruler, he also has the added value of receiving a gift from his Odin. But bear in mind, that's a secondary element of the Hanokah we're looking at. And the Ikke is from Parano and Dishim and Lashon. Really, the main thing Yosef got was the authority from Paroi, which was facilitated by the Eibishter sending Gabriel to teach him. Because it's actually that elevation of stature that freed Yosef to the nth degree, and that's really what we're looking at. Hanokah is to give this Eved the absolute freedom, which includes, of course, the freedom of wealth and, in his case, authority. Now that we have a different perspective from an halachic perspective of the two elements of Hanokah, that it's not just simply the responsibility of the Adon to show his gratitude, but it's also to facilitate the true freedom of the servant. Fits with something else that Rabbi tells us about what the mystical meaning of Hanokah is. Not physical gifts, but in this case, the gifts of understanding. In the Rishima analysis, because there, the Rabbi explains, as Evet Ivri Orak Pchinas Meichin de Katnos, that a person who is in this category of Evet Ivri implies that they have limited, immature understanding and appreciation of Hashem. When a person then masters that particular stage of Avodah, then he becomes free. Free means that his mind opens up to true chokhmah and true bina. So when that person is freed from this limited, immature understanding of the Eibishter, there has to be a gift that accompanies him. What is the gift? The access to more mature, higher, profound insight and understanding of the Eibishter chokhmah and bina. And that's where the gift, so to speak, flows to him, the gift of insight, the gift of knowledge and wisdom that he was very limited in before as an Eved Ivri. Zetman, which illustrates, the gift that accompanies a slave when he is freed is not just a bonus, because he worked so hard, now we're going to give him a gift of gratitude. The gift is the freedom. The prison he lived in was the prison of the mind, the limitations of the mind. The gift is the opening of the mind. And that fits perfectly with what we've just explained according to the halachic definition that the gift of Hanokah is what completes the freedom of the slave. Mitzvah Hanokah is not by Eved Ivri, va'amevriya, or need by an Eved Kanani. And that will also help us understand why it is that the gifts are something we only have to give to Jewish slaves and not to the Eved Kanani. Of course, you might say that's because the Eved Kanani doesn't get freed. But Pashas Yishlema Atam by Eved Kanani is you'd say that the pasuk tells us clearly that you're supposed to inherit or bequeath an Eved Kanani to the next generation, la'olam bahem ta'avodu, and keep them as slaves indefinitely. We're not permitted to free them unless there are extenuating circumstances or particular mitzvah. Seeing as the Torah generally speaks about the most common cases, we're not going to speak about the outlier case where you are actually supposed to release an Eved Kanani. Okay, so that's the simplest explanation. There's no mitzvah of Hanokah because there's no releasing of an Eved Kanani. But what does it mean spiritually? The truth is, based on the spiritual insight that we've just seen from the Rebbe's father, there's actually a big question: why don't we also facilitate this wisdom and this insight for the Eved Kanani? Perhaps he needs it more than anybody else. Many places in Chassidus, we're told that the Eved Ivri is somebody who's already reached the level of Yetzirah. The Amo Ivri is somebody who's already reached the level of Bria, and yet they still need they need the gift of expanding the mind and understanding and perception of godliness. Then surely the Eved Kanani, who is a representation of those who live in the lowest reality, in Olam Ha'asiyah, surely they also need the gift of this opening of the mind to be able to appreciate godliness. Now that we understand that the purpose of Hanokah is directly linked to the process of freeing somebody, and they effectively do the same thing, because the more gift you give, the freer he is as verstandig, then everything starts to make sense. Because the person who's an Eved Kanani, when we understand what an Eved Kanani is in spiritual terms, we understand that person remains in the reality of an Eved Kanani indefinitely. Let's understand that. It's not an insult to the Evet Kanani. The Evet Kanani actually has a secret that, in a certain way, puts him ahead of the others. It says, various places in Chassidus explain as the union from Evet Ivri and Am Ivriya in Avodah Adam is the Avodah from Birur Hamidus. The whole concept of being a slave in spiritual terms means working hard at refining, elevating, and transforming our characteristics. Mashenken Evet Kanani, that's if you're an Evet Ivri or an Am Ivriya. Whereas an Evet Kanani is in Yona Kabbalah Sol. The whole purpose of an Evet Kanani is just to do as he's told. As you'd see in the reality of a regular Evet Kanani, that's somebody who would much prefer to live a life that is unbounded and unfettered. And he's only serving the master because he's afraid of the master, which gives the impression that the Evet Kanani is behind the spiritual track. The Evet Ivri, Am Ivri are working on personal refinement. But as the Dage von an Evet Kanani is niedrig, the Dage von Evet Ivri and Am Ivriya, yes, it's true that an Evet Kanani represents somebody who's at a lower spiritual level than the other two. But was der Din and the Meibishen is mit Gefilung Geschmack Midas, because the Evet Ivri and the Am Ivriya serve the Eibishter with a tangible sense of emotional attachment. Von deswegen hat die Avodah von Evet Kanani merit die Midas habitul. But what the Evet Kanani has to a greater extent than they do is bitul. And Evet Ivri and Am Ivriya was avidosins verbunden mit Midas. Let's analyze it this way. If the Evet Ivri and the Am Ivriya, which are primarily serving the Eibishter through a sense of feeling, yes, they still fall into the category of Evet, which means that they are still serving the Eibishter out of Kabbalah Sol, out of dedication. But they're working with Midas, which means that they have a sense of self. I feel, I love. Whereas the Evet Kanani doesn't have any investment of emotion in how he serves the Eibishter. So why is the Evet Kanani serving the Eibishter? Primarily because I'm dedicated. Primarily because I accept the authority of the Eibishter. Without any sense of self. He doesn't have the sophistication of personal appreciation. And that's actually the deeper meaning why the concept of an Evet Kanani cannot be freed, cannot be changed. The Avodah from Piramidus by Evet Ivri and Am Ivriya, if you're like the Evet Ivri and the Am Ivriya, and you're working on the refining and elevating character. So refining character means I'm talking about me, my reality, my character, my personality traits. The far is number one. Well, if it's me that we're working with, there's a limit to how much I can work. So at some point, I'll finish the work. Furthermore, the shleimus from the avodah gufa is, how do I know I've completed the work? When I'm freed from that stage, when I no longer have to work in this environment. I'm now a free person. I'm no longer beholden to this particular area of work. I escape the world of Midas, where Midas, quite frankly, are trapped in their particular reality. Chesed is chesed is chesed. It cannot entertain the possibility of Gevurah. Moichin, mind, on the other hand, can accommodate paradox. So I break free of the world that I was in. And therefore, the objective of an Evet Ivri or an Am Ivri is to be freed. Whereas if you're serving the Eibishter in the mode of the Evet Kanani, which is complete acceptance of authority without any consciousness of self, you relinquish the self. In the same way as the Evet, whatever he owns belongs to the master. So the spiritual Evet Kanani doesn't have a sense of what I want, what I enjoy, what I feel. Is completely beholden to the master. So how's it possible to ever be freed? Because first of all, if a person has that degree of absolute bittul, it has no limit, it has no end. Bittul doesn't run out. You don't graduate from bittul. So you can never be freed from that avodah. Beis nochmer, even deeper. In der avodah zane moichin tavadas shel ha'adam mevalvel. If a person is dedicating themselves to the Eibishter with absolute commitment, Kabbalah Sol, bittul, then if there is a sense of emotion, if there is a sense of intellect, it gets in the way. In them So therefore, there's no room here to give the gift of intellect, because that's not going to service this particular avodah. It's going to interfere with this particular avodah. If I understand, I have less bittul. Now, rather the person, so to speak, is completely beholden to the wisdom and insight and perspective of the Adon. Or as it's called in Chazal, the person opens their mouth and it's the Eibishter Shechina speaking. Itmar, as it says in the Gemara. Itmar, it was stated. There's no me, there's no I said. Itmar, it happened automatically. The expression of godliness directly through the person. So you'd think, wow, the Eved Kanani is this incredible person with absolute bittul. So what's the value of the Eved Ivri and the Am Ivriya? Trotz der Meile von bittul, was ist da in der Avodah von Eved Kanani? Yes, there is a great advantage to serving the Eibishter with absolute bittul, as the Eved Kanani does. Nevertheless, the Jewish people, generally speaking, Avodaihem were considered Eved Ivri. Versteht ihr Chassidus? As the pasuk explains, the pasuk says that the Eved Ivri serves for 6 years, and in the 7th year it goes free. That alludes to the fact that we, the Eibishter servants, have to serve the Eibishter for how long? The 6 millennia of the world as we know it. The 7th millennium, that is a time of absolute reward. And then we will go free without the responsibility of mitzvahs as we know them currently. Okay, shame. Vidos is in Klolus Avodah, and that broader sense of how we serve the Eibishter across the span of history is reflected in our daily service of the Eibishter. In the Sheish Zameachol, Daf Bayim Zayin, the Avodah B'Terech Ve'Omer. 6 days of the week we're supposed to really invest and work within the world as the Eibishter guides us to. And then we have the rest of Shabbos, when we are released from those responsibilities. So the explanation is this. Why is it that we're compared to an Eved Ivri if the Eved Kanani seems to be the highest form of dedication to the Eibishter? Because the Meinini Flovas is doing them bittul muchlut for an Eved Kanani, in spite of the tremendous value and greatness of the Eved Kanani, who is completely beholden and committed to the master. But the ultimate is that we should serve the Eibishter in dual service. Sai bittul, yes, we have to have absolute bittul to the Eibishter. But we are not supposed to overlook or relinquish the soul powers that the Eibishter gave us. On the bittul, so durchnehmen die koiches. In fact, the challenge is that the bittul should seep through into our mind and into our feelings. That I should understand and I should appreciate and I should enjoy my avodah from a perspective of bittul. Part of the bittul is to accept that the Eibishter wants me to have a geschmack in the mitzvahs that I do. It's not good enough just to be like a stone. That's why the general principle of how we represent serving the Eibishter is like an Eved Ivri. A dedication to the Eibishter, yes, with a sense of our own appreciation. And not only are we supposed to feel a connection and a geschmack in our service of the Eibishter, but we're supposed to graduate from that to a point of Shishler, where we are freed by only serving the Eibishter based on feelings, and to be able to serve the Eibishter with a deep, meaningful understanding of what the Eibishter wants from us and why. Until we get to the highest level of so-called freedom, which is when we're gifted. Gifted means what? Like the Rebbe's father said, that the Eibishter gives us the gift of opening our minds, which takes that part of our Avodas Hashem that we understand and elevates it to a totally different degree of understanding, divine understanding rather than human understanding. With all of that in mind, now that we understand the power of Hanukah, both what it means to the person who's being released and how it consolidates their freedom, and the spiritual message behind it, now we understand that the Medrash tells us whatever the Eibishter tells us to do, is based on the pasuk that the Eibishter gives us His words. Whatever He tells us to do, He does too. Is therefore moving, as I say, is a seich when again the mitzvah Hanukah, was the Eibishter is mekayim and gilt as Adon zu die Eden, seine Avodim. Then we can appreciate that the mitzvah of Hanukkah that we're supposed to do for our slaves, the Eibusher does for us, who are his slaves. That tells us that when we speak about the 6 millennia of working hard to serve the Eibusher and the 7th millennium being this time of freedom, it's not just freedom. It's a time of gift from the Eibusher, double gift, additional gifting from the Eibusher. And because the halacha says that before Shabbos comes in, we're supposed to sample the various dishes of Shabbos. The same applies. Number one, it means already now on the spiritual Erev Shabbos of history, we're supposed to start to taste the freedom and rest that Mashiach's times is supposed to be all about. But we're also supposed to start getting a taste of the gifts that the Eibusher has for us during that period. The gift of insight. And when we get that sample, we get that taste of the gifts, we get that taste of the rest of the time of Mashiach, we should then graduate from just the taste to actually fully eating all of the various dishes that the Eibusher, so to speak, has prepared for us. And as a damu basa kipsar, that becomes part and parcel of us, like when you eat food and it's absorbed into your system. We should experience for real the coming of Mashiach and Tchias HaMeisim. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, because the ultimate purpose for which the world was created is the time of Mashiach and Tchias HaMeisim. We should get the main purpose for which the world was created, which is the tremendous so-called reward that we'll get in the time of the 7th millennium with the coming of Mashiach, and that should be something we experience literally right now.